I would now like to call on Dr. Mark Igiehon.
I would like to use some slides if you would.
Do you want me to make you a host?
Yes, please. That would be helpful. Okay. Then I can share my slides. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Today is an honor to be invited to speak to such an audience and also to speak to distinguished in midst of this distinguished panel like this. If you give me a minute, I'm just going to share my slides. I have a few slides. I'll be speaking about capacity development from a national perspective. I do, so by myself, I'm ex-Shell, a lawyer by training, but I've done so many things since that time. Working across the whole world in Nigeria, studied in Nigeria. I'm a lawyer by training as well, like I said. Bachelor's in Nigeria, master's in London, and doctorate in Southampton. I worked for Shell many years, but now I lead a group called Aberdeen Commercial and All Minerals for Good, where we've really focused on how can countries better utilize mineral resources. As you know, many of the countries, including Nigeria, which your magazine is focused on, suffers what we call the resource cost, where the resources rather is a cost rather than a blessing. So that's one of the major things we focus on, and we're developing new ways of doing that. So we work with governments and industry and also communities to change that narrative. Right, I want to look at capacity development from a national perspective. There's individual level, obviously, there's organizational level, but I want to look at it from government perspective. And then I'm going to start off by looking at some data. If you look at the index of government effectiveness, this is an index that tracks every year how effective are governments. In that index, you would see 193 nations are tracked. In last year's index, 2019, Singapore, I've highlighted Singapore, I've just used some examples here. Singapore is number one, even before the US and the UK. And that's amazing because Singapore got independence in the 60s. And Singapore is the only country that the people cried when they became independent because they were kicked out of the Malaysian Federation. Other people got independence. In their own case, they were kicked out from the Malaysian Federation because they were too poor, they were too troublesome. So their prime minister cried on that day. Flip some 55 years later, they are number one in almost every indices in the world. So there's something there that is worth exploring. The second country I would like to draw attention to is Botswana. Botswana is apart from, I think, in Mauritius, is the number one country, is the highest placed country in Africa on the indexes again. So that's also something there. So what's Botswana doing well? That is worth looking at. Rwanda, a country that suffered genocide that was completely, as it were, messed up some years back. Now they are one of the top in Africa. Then you go down to Ghana, coming up, Kenya. Nigeria is 167 out of 193. So you are focused on Nigeria. So you can see that that is very, very low. This is talking about the effectiveness of government as an index of in terms of the health of the country in a sense. So when you have because specifically when we talked about we're also talking about the SARS issues and the youths. So when you see all of this, you see that the lower the countries are in the index, then the more susceptible they are to upheavals and crises and the others. I mean, look at Yemen is the last there, Somalia, Venezuela. So you can see that. So my proposition is that these challenges, this poor effectiveness is a question of capacity. It's a question of capacity at governmental level. There is a large gap in capacity in many of these countries. So the higher they are on the index, then you can say that the more capable they are to run things as they ought to be. So I'll just go on forward. Now, why is it that many of these African countries, most of the African countries, lie in the lower, in those lower axes? Why is that? In my own analysis, it's a function of three things. First of all, it's a legacy of colonialism, because when colonialism came to Africa, what it did essentially was to essentially unravel all the existing structures, whether they were kingdoms or empires or the peoples. Colonialism largely, not in all cases, but largely unraveled the whole thing. You unraveled all that. So they left. So when colonialism was leaving, it left, governments and structures based on what colonialists left. But fundamentally, there was fundamentally a lot of the elements were unstable and unwieldy. And then what could have happened after that is that the colonial elites, those who took over from the colonial powers, would have then built their nations. And that's where Botswana was different. Botswana is probably the only country in Africa where they actually did that, structured nation building. Immediately they got independence. They didn't just carry on the same way. They actually sat down and rebuilt the whole nation. They connected it with what was their old structures before the colonialists came. So I give you some examples of what Botswana did. One of the things they did, for example, they sat down and redesigned the structure of their country based on what was before. So for example, in Botswana, the parliament is a rubber stamp parliament. Now, usually when you say that in any place, when you say rubber stamp, it means that it's almost that means it's not working functionally. But actually what Botswana did was the other way around. They empowered and those pre-colonial councils, tribal councils, and all that. And so whenever there's any major decision to be made in the country, all of those councils, they discuss, they debate, and then they reach a consensus. And then that consensus is passed to Parliament to go and enact. So Parliament is not just the bunch of people out there just doing whatever they think. It's well connected to the pre-colonial structure. So you can see how they roped in the old and the new. What else did they do? Their court structures. Their court structures. In Botswana, the courts are very not so busy. Why? Because most decisions, most disputes are resolved by those same local community tribal councils. So they really reworked their whole country based on connecting with the old. So that's what most African countries have not done. And they've not done it either because they were not allowed to, because as you know, many of the countries, once they got independence, the early leaders who came out of colonialism, leading them were early removed or killed, or during the Cold War, or coups and the like, or the leaders themselves, nobody hurt them, but they're just unable to create new countries out of it. So that's a large part of the problem. So there's a concept which you talk about, we talk about incomplete metamorphosis. So the country should have evolved and metamorphosed, 60 years now in case of Nigeria, but that hasn't been there. Although a lot of progress have been made over the last 20 years, at least for the past 20 years, there's been democracies functioning, hands over government. So there's a good prospect over there. So looking at that, therefore, I look at a few examples of some countries that are worth looking at: Singapore, Botswana, and I'll tell you why reasons. Obviously, UAE, Dubai. These are outlying countries. If you look at the Middle East, by far UAE and Dubai are ahead of the pack. Look at Africa, Botswana is ahead of the pack. Ethiopia and Rwanda are doing so well right now. They've turned around. And then I won't have enough time, but I've gone into the Israeli military, not Israel itself. Israel itself is amazing, but the military, some of the things they do. So, but based on that, I've just identified, a whole list of things. The list of things. What I consider as the capacities, the practices of how effective countries and organizations, how they develop capacity, and this should be a blueprint for those in looking at developing their countries in Africa, Nigeria. Number one is strategic long-term thinking. That is very, very long-term. I worked in an organization in which there are different levels of planning, even up to what we call 50-year scenario planning. I mean, that is almost ridiculous, but that's the kind of level of long-term thinking that some organizations do. You have nations that are organizations that are led by learners. In other words, learners, the leaders themselves that are active learners, active learners, and they are actively learning, and therefore they're updating themselves, upgrading themselves, and then they can teach that to their leadership. So, for example, I give an example. Lin Kuo Yew, who essentially was the midwife of what we know today as Singapore. I mean, he's in so many ways, but just one example. Anytime he travels, he buys a set of books. When it goes back, all the cabinet, they read the same book and they discuss it together. Just one simple way, but you can imagine how impactful that was. So they keep thinking, they keep refreshing. You need national memory or corporate memory in organizations. That is so vital. Like, I can tell so many examples of my own personal experience where corporate memory, was so vital to saving, the bacon on a certain day. In the same way, corporate memory, national memory is important, and that allows for continuity. You need a lot of show and telling. Linda just gave an example of what her unit did under the government of that nation. She's showing and telling, the experiences, the testimonies. That more is so powerful when leaders talk about what has been and what will be. Then of course they have a long structure of mentoring and discipleship. When Lin Kuo Yew retired as prime minister, they didn't allow him go. They gave him an honorary position called minister mentor. Minister mentor. So they officially appointed. You just can't leave. You'll be a minister mentor. So that was his final position before he passed on. It was a minister mentor, mentoring all everyone else behind him. So there was that continuity and releasing the people. So I'm not going to go through the whole list, but it's just a few things for us to think about. Solutions, innovations, and also I'll just carry on. Yes. So I just carry on. Then the other thing as well is that you need a lot of oh, sorry, is the phone somewhere in somebody will put it up in a minute now.
Okay.
So yeah. So in terms of looking at just building up on that, talk about foundations. Countries need foundations, obviously. Like I said, a lot of African states are in a sense on shaky ground, because that's how they were when they left independence. But a lot of those nations need foundations. And what do? You have new generations that are inventing foundations. Here in United Kingdom, I'm based in Aberdeen here right now. And from here we go to the nations. Here you see a lot of debate going on in Europe, Brexit. You look at Scotland, Scots exit, all those debates is because every nation from time to time will need to relook at their foundations again and rebuild it, and strengthen it. So that is one key thing that I think that the nation needs to do to rebuild capacity. The organization obviously needs to be solid. You need to build a capacity in the organization that can run, things. In many of these countries are down in the ladder of ineffective countries. Many things don't really work because the organization is not there to put it all to hang together. So order and organization is very, 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 very important. Once you allow this order, then eventually, it's going to lead to a weakening of the whole system. Innovating is also a very key element at national level, organizational level, and even individual level. Particularly as we're coming out of this COVID-19 situation, that is calling for all-round innovation. Even individuals, you innovate yourself by developing new capacities, doing things that you haven't done before, going into a new sphere or a new space, and that was a picture that the previous speaker just shared with us of how during her time in that unit, they decided to innovate and come up with something that was new. And I saw in the chat room that Katie also mentioned that Obama had a similar unit of behavioral insight unit. So you can see governments, should be innovating and innovating Drucker, who is one of my favorite, scholars, talked about, the key role of leadership is to innovate the old and to manage the new. In other words, innovation is constantly that. Let me talk about growing people. One of the mysteries of life, which is not very easy to appreciate, but it comes up, is the fact that if you have small people who have little capacity, then they will produce little work. It was interesting hearing the first speaker. I was talking about the fact that some of those multilateral institutions, World Bank and NASA, have the highest proportion of PhDs. And that makes sense because those guys have to do incredible stuff. I mean, NASA to take somebody to the space, to moon and come back safely. I mean, so it's no wonder that they put out the best, they search for the best, the PhDs and all the thinkers, as well. And many organizations, the same thing as well. I know in my organization where we used to work, we had a strategy unit, the scenario unit. Those guys are all PhDs and and all of the like. So you put your best to work. So in other words, part of the challenge that a lot of countries in Africa have to deal with is the fact that the people who are if you want great things to happen, you need to put great people in place. This is where meritocracy comes in. If you put small people in place for whatever reason, then you're going to get small results. It's just linear. It's not immediately intuitive, but that is just the decision. Is if you put small people in place, they will produce small results. If you put big people in place, they will be good people in place. So one of the objectives of leadership then, and even for ourselves individually, is to grow big. And when I mean big, I don't mean big in physical size, not by eating McDonald's and increasing weight, but you know what I mean. Big in capacity, big in thinking, being able to achieve things. So I'm a leader in many friends, and I know that it's frustrating sometimes when you're expecting good results, but you don't get it. You have to realize that it's what you put in is what you put, garbage in, garbage out. So that's one thing that African nations have to really think about, really think hardly about. Sometimes in Africa, people think more about tribe and other thing else. I saw a joke somebody said to me, said Americans have become tribal, like Africans. They're not divided into tribes, everybody wants to vote according to tribe and all of that. So it doesn't augur well in the longer term. You put the best people in, and then you grow what you have already so that they can be big enough to do what it takes. So I've just put some principle down here, in terms of how to grow people, but I won't spend too much time on that. Just some principles, to grow things. Don't focus on growing things, but also focus on growing people. Then the grown people will produce grown results, and therefore we should always carefully search and deploy the best people for the assignment. I've seen many cases in my work with, particularly countries and governments. It's very challenging, work with many governments across Africa. Very challenging when you just realize that, this thing, whatever they're doing, is not going to work because they just have a clue of what's going on. And Africa is really blessed, with people all over. So let's Africa put the best to use. Now, I'll just say a few words before I finish on what's going on in Nigeria, the SARS. I wasn't planning to do that, but I think when Son and I were discussing, we had a great conversation. And so I just put a few thoughts on the table, on SARS. If I were advising the Nigerian government on end SARS, I would say to them, don't allow the creation of a sense of a crisis. One of the things leaders should do is to keep everyone calm. I'm a Bible scholar, so pardon me for using Bible analogy. One of the things Christ does was, when the wind, the storm was all raging, what did he do? Peace, be still. Then after that, he talks to the people. Why did you guys do this? Why did you do that? So to create the sense of opportunity rather than a crisis, and then of course the youths, like we see, the part of the reason why we've seen already some of the what we talked about earlier in terms of effectiveness of government. So the youths have they're angry, they have a lot of energy. Best thing to do is to harness it, make them partners into the future, and don't make them to be enemies, because because they are your people. And like Ekede said at the beginning, in Africa, I think about 40 to 50% of about 40% are under 18. you know, and then the youth are about 50-60% of the population. So, I mean, the only way to go forward is to harness them, you know. And then what do you do? I think Nigeria, they have a lot of easy wins, what we call low-hanging fruits, things that they can do right now that will just change the environment, you know, make some big noise. For example, I know there's a Rosai report that's recommended for many years. I think that's been done for like many governments now, you know, since Jonathan's government, you know, and that the bureaucracy of the federal government should be reduced to so many numbers. So that's an easy win. Implement that, make a big noise about it, you know, and channel towards it. And that will also address the question of what they're asking for, you know, the parliament is too expensive and all of that. You know, we'll take the easy one and do that. Policing itself is quite old. The police is 60 years old since it was handed over by the British. And since that time, Nigeria has doubled in population to nearly 200 million, you know, from what it was at independence. You know, that's like 3 or 4 times the country. So therefore, by definition, the original design and construct of the police force, as an example, it's not just the police force. Almost many institutions are completely outdated. They are old. They are no longer functional. So they need innovating anyway. So if I were advising the government, I would say, don't just change NSAS to SWAT. You know, use the opportunity to sit back and reinvent the whole policing. There's been talked about state police and all of that. Those are all the signs that this thing is too old, it's creaking, the organization is creaking. And not just police, but there are so many other structures like that that are too old, that have been led by the British. Nobody has sat down to redesign it, to reconstruct it, even for the present age. You know, I was one of the countries we work with in Europe right here. For example, they look at everything in major ways every 10 years. Every 10 years, they do a major review. In many cases, they don't have to do anything new. Everything's working well, but it's just a natural cycle they develop for themselves. Every 10 years, they look at all the fundamental structures again and just look at that. So then, of course, the youth themselves, they need to be trained. They assume that they will do better when they get to government. And I tell them always, because we do a lot of training with youth as well. I tell them, if you get there, you're going to do worse, because nobody has trained you. Nobody has trained you for government. So why do you think you're going to, that's how you going to do any better? You know, nobody has trained you. Nobody has mentored you. I was looking at the profile of the Prime Minister in New Zealand, then who's done so well with COVID-19. And then you discover that through her, she was one of the policy advisors on Tony Blair's team. So you can see there's a track record of people who grew up in the system. So they know how to do a few things when they get to government. So the youths of Africa, the thing for them to do is, if they think they can do better, what they should start doing now is to go and submit themselves to formal training, formal workshop, working and internship and the others, and then of course let the leaders bring them alongside, you know, and widen their profile. So that's where I would stop. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Please, if you can put me back as the host. Thank you very, very much. There are quite a lot of similarities, even though your focus is on the national. There's a lot of similarities between what you have talked about and what Mrs. Oyiehon and Linda, they've talked about. And what you are saying is that there needs to be a lot of learning, and there also needs to be solid foundations, that there's a need for us to track the index. That what is happening now is that on an index, the countries that are actually below are susceptible to unrest and protest, and as against countries that are at the top of their game. And you've given examples of Botswana in Africa, of Malaysia, of Rwanda, and of Singapore. And also you have helpfully talked about what is going on in Nigeria at the moment, the NSAS protest. And you've given, like advice in terms of the young people, that there needs to be, in terms of the old people, that there needs to be innovation, and for the old, that they need to learn. They have to be experts, which is similar to what Mrs. Oyiehon was saying. You need to have something to bring in place. And also, what was similar between yourself and Linda was the need to learn, to be learners-led, and also in terms of when people grow, everything grows. Focus on growing, that we should always grow as institutions, as a community, as individuals, and as a people. And that we should never let a good crisis go to waste. The thing with that is that with every challenge, it's an opportunity. So looking at crisis as an area of development, as an area for us to bring forth innovation, and that we need to be trained. We cannot just assume we know it all.